Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to TMACC's program on telework and taxation. My name is Tim Phelps, and I will be your host for today's discussion. It is an honor and a privilege to serve as the Executive Director for the Transportation Management Association of Chester County. And also, I am now the newly elected President for the Mid-Atlantic Chapter for the Association of Commuter Transportation. And that is our regional chapter of our industry trade organization, ACT. For those that are joining us today for the first time, TMACC is a membership-based organization. We are one of 7 transportation management associations in the Delaware Valley. And our role as a TMA is to work with employers to identify strategies that will help reduce congestion and improving air quality. These strategies include biking, public transportation, van pool, ride sharing, and also telecommuting. So on Friday, March 13th, we all powered down our computers, loaded a few extra items in our work bags, and we wished each other a good weekend, with all thinking that we would be back in the office in about 2 weeks. Now here, for 7 months, we have successfully implemented what we refer to in our office as a forced telework strategy within our community corporate culture. So as communities begin to incorporate telework into their long-term strategies and grapple with their taxes for 2020, we believe now is the time to tackle the taxation issue which occurs that's wrapped around telework. Now, as a disclaimer for today, TMACC nor our panelists are providing any tax advice. So please always consult with your accountant, tax attorney, or your tax advisor for that. So now for over 25 years, telework has been an issue that the federal nor the state governments have been able to pass a unified tax measure for. And this is really important now because we have this growing mobile workforce in our community. So for cities that draw on multiple states, such as Boston and New York City, and then states that workforce that cross state boundaries like Delaware and Pennsylvania, telework taxation becomes a challenge, and each entity, state or city, is trying to defend those tax dollars that they use to support their organizations. The reason TMACC is hosting today's seminar is to create a better understanding of the potential tax liability due to the number of residents and employees commuting between Newcastle and Chester County. For me personally, this literally hits home. My wife is employed by a large chemical company headquartered in Newcastle County, but for the past 7 months, she has worked out of our home here in East Whiteland. So today we have 2 great panelists with us to talk about these issues. The first person I'd like to introduce is Jennifer Breton. She's an associate with Buckley, Brion, McGuire, and Morris here in Chester County. Jennifer is the member of the firm's transaction practice group. She has been practicing law for 10 years in a variety of practice areas, including estates and trusts, business transactions, tax, litigation, and insurance defense. Jennifer graduated with a Master's of Law in Taxation and Estate Planning certificate from Temple University's Beasley School of Law. While at Temple, she received the Faculty Award for the Taxation Program. And she also won the LLM division of the prestigious American Bar Association's Law Student Tax Challenge. Jennifer received her Juris Doctor from Widener University of Law, where she nobly served as the editor-in-chief of the Widener Law Review. She also has a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Westchester University with a concentration in communication. Jennifer is a member of the American Bar Association's section of taxation. She also is a member of the Chester County Bar Association, where she is the chairperson of the tax practice section. Also joining us today is Mo Bell Jacobs. He is the manager for tax services with RSM US LLP in Washington, D.C. I had an opportunity to listen in to a dialogue that Mo had a couple weeks ago, and I knew that he was the guy that we wanted to hear from. So Mo is a member of RSM's Washington National Tax Group and examines state and local tax issues and the impact of legislation on middle market companies. He is responsible for tracking legislation, reviewing significant court developments, and providing client services and acting as a technical resource. Prior to joining RSM, Mo was a manager in a Big Four firm rotating between Washington's National Tax, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh offices. Before beginning a career in public accounting, Mo was a state and local tax attorney in Harrisburg, and Mo is originally from the Harrisburg region. And Mo, too, is a graduate from the Widener University Commonwealth Law School. So you're not here to hear me talk. You're here to hear from Mo and Jennifer. So there are two key definitions that we'll be talking about today. Mo will be taking one of those, and Mo will be talking about the national perspective of this. And then Jennifer will follow up on the second of the two definitions, and she'll be talking about more about Chester County and its relationship to Delaware, as well as some things between Philadelphia and Chester County. So let's start out. Mo, what's Nexus?
Thanks, Tim. I wanted to say thank you for having us. Thank you to TMACC. This is a really interesting opportunity. I think from my perspective and Jennifer's as well, we hope that you can have some takeaways today. Maybe you see some concepts that you've heard about, and you can maybe see how they apply a little bit more in this, I hate to say it, in this new normal that we have. And I'm going to try to use some examples too to better illustrate that. So I'm going to work out here, sharing my screen. Okay. And hopefully, all right. And if you can't see the slide deck, please let me know. But if there's silence, I assume that it's working well. So again, thank you very much. The first thing we want to talk about today is Nexus, and I want to briefly talk about this from a conceptual standpoint, what it means, and then later on we'll talk about why it's important, and I think it feeds into some of the things Jennifer is going to talk about as well. Nexus means connection. It literally means having a connection, and essentially a state cannot subject you personally or your business to a state or local income tax unless you have nexus with that taxing jurisdiction. Most of the time, this means having employees or having a physical presence in that jurisdiction. So if you have a salesperson go into a new state, you could create nexus in that state. If you have inventory in that state, you can create nexus in that state. Also, more recently, within nexus law, we talk a lot about market activity, because you don't really need a physical presence anymore to have a nexus. If you have a lot of sales or a lot of receipts from a new jurisdiction, new taxing jurisdiction, you can have nexus in that jurisdiction as well. On the state side, or on the local side, for example, you go into Philadelphia to work at all, you now have a nexus in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia is one of our localities that will impose an income tax on you for every minute that you work in the city. There's also a related concept I want to mention, and then we'll talk about later too, and that's Public Law 86-272. This is a federal law, a federal safe harbor from state income tax nexus, and it's a very narrow provision. It was passed in 1959 by Eisenhower. It was a different, very goods-based economy, and why 86-272 is important is that some of your businesses may be taking that protection, and it only applies when you have nexus in a state, but your only activity in that state is the solicitation of sales for tangible personal property. So it's a very narrow safe harbor, and it only applies to income tax. So it doesn't apply to franchise taxes, doesn't apply to sales taxes. And we'll talk about those two concepts a little more here in a few minutes. So as Tim mentioned, March 13th, same date for us at RSM. We went home, we thought, okay, we're gonna let this blow over 2 weeks and we'll be back at work, and that didn't happen. A little over 7 months later, we're seeing that. From our business side, we focused a lot on the middle market, and I'm not sure, that's kind of gimmicky how we advertise that, but RSM is the middle market firm. We do have big clients, we have small clients. I think as we look at our client base and we look at what we've seen in our businesses over the last 6 and 7 months, we have a lot of clients entering this virtual space, kind of like it sounds like TMACC has, and then they're going to remain virtual once this is over. So knock on wood, this ends in I don't know, the next year. We have a vaccine or we have it under control. We all start going back to work. I think a lot of businesses are seeing now there's some advantage to virtual um, workforce arrangements. One advantage, office space. If you're in New York or downtown Philadelphia, DC, San Francisco, you might not need that huge downtown office anymore. If one, you don't have employees in the office, and two, you don't have people coming into your office to meet. So we're seeing a lot of that right now. Another concept is that businesses are discovering that with the technology that exists today, there's no sacrificing either the products or the services these businesses have delivered to their customers because of a remote workforce. I think for a long time there was some bias that says, if we have a lot of people working remotely, especially in big businesses, big accounting firms, big law firms, that if you have these remote workforces, the quality of the work is going to suffer. I think that's shown not to be true, and part of that is very excellent technology. We have Skype and Teams and Cisco products, so the work has maintained. So it's another benefit, and say, okay, we can actually stay in a remote workforce, in a remote workforce environment. Not all businesses can do that. If you're a manufacturing business, well, you're going to have people on site. We've also seen a number of businesses kind of segment this in a way where they maybe have their IT function go remote, their HR, their accounting, their tax. So you have some of those jobs remote and some on site to the extent that you can. So clients expanding remote workforce arrangements. I think probably most people on this call have experienced this in some way. A few interesting examples. We work with a large investment banking firm. So this firm has 6 offices around the country, a couple thousand employees. Employees make all types of salary ranges. Some are on the very high end. This is a very stressful job we're discovering, and these guys hire 400 to 500 interns every single year. They have to hire the interns because after the internship, they hire them as full-time employees because there's so much turnover in this job. I guess it's a high stress market job. Make a lot of money, then you get out. So now this year, they have to hire virtual interns. They need to hire the interns. If they don't hire the interns, they don't have people to replace the people that leave. And we're seeing that, okay, now we're hiring 400 to 500 virtual interns that are located all over the country. So now we have state and local tax considerations because you have people in states where the business doesn't exist, where the business isn't registered, where the business isn't registered for unemployment insurance, where they don't pay income tax. So, and they don't have any employees before that. So now they're paying interns that are located all over the country. So it's just one example of what the impact of remote workforce could look like. Another example, board of directors meetings. The directors are located all over the country for a lot of businesses. In some cases, these meetings could cause nexus issues, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. Decentralizing or closing offices. I think it's a theme among at least our client space that decentralizing could be a benefit. So like I said, you might move the IT function out. If you're close to a state border, so here on this side of Pennsylvania, you have a number of other states, New York and New Jersey too. If you have that downtown New York City office, a downtown Philadelphia office, maybe it's easier to have and cheaper to have a footprint somewhere else, especially with your employees not coming into work. And the nature of work may be changing permanently. I think one of the things that I like about public accounting was that there's a lot of work flexibility, but most people still went to work. I worked from home a few days, but I still went to work. I think even in the next year, if this ends, I wouldn't be surprised if we're going to have 30% or more of our workforce continuing to stay remote. So this is going to impact, how much office space do we need? What other considerations are we going to be thinking about? So nexus. So we talked about nexus very briefly. If you have an employee in a new state, you could have nexus in that state, and then you could have state and local tax considerations because of that. Why do we want to talk about this? Generally, especially on state borders, if you have employees that telecommute into your office, it's never been an issue for the business where the employee lays their head at night. So if your employees sleep on a pillow in a different state, that's generally not an issue for the business. With remote work, now you have your full-time employees working possibly in other states. And if you didn't have nexus in those states, you now have full-time employees doing their duties, doing their job in a different state. Because of that, that business could have sales tax nexus, income tax nexus, just because of their remote work. We talked briefly about 86-272 and how it's a safe harbor protection if you're selling tangible personal property. I think there's probably a lot of service businesses on the call, so not many of you may actually take the 86-272 protection. But in some cases, if the state has said, you have nexus, but for this pandemic, we're not going to, we're going to develop a policy that says you don't have nexus for now if you have telecommuting employees in our state. It's basically a taxpayer-friendly guidance that some states have provided. If a state has done that and you're in one of these states, I think Pennsylvania is one of them, that says if you have employees in Pennsylvania and you generally don't have presence in Pennsylvania, you don't have nexus in Pennsylvania. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're still protected from 86-272 if you were already taking that protection. So some states have issued COVID-19 specific guidance. We have about 14 or 15 states that have come out and said, if you have an employee in our state because they live in this state and now they're working in the state, because of the pandemic, because of COVID-19, we're going to be nice and say that that employee doesn't create nexus. Any other time that employee creates nexus because they're doing their job in our state. But because of the pandemic, we're not. This has also come over somewhat into withholding guidance too. Now, Jennifer is going to talk about a really interesting concept called the convenience of the employer role, which I think it's attached to this in a lot of ways. So we don't like to show maps very often. This is a survey map from the B&A publication. This is really just to show you how complex telecommuting employees can be and the impact on when we look at state and local taxes as a whole. Generally, telecommuting employees, if you have employees working in another state, that could create nexus in that state. Especially now in the pandemic, you have people moving all over the place. I mentioned that we have this investment firm client. One of the things that we're also seeing is that client has maybe 6 or 7 offices around the country, but they have thousands of employees. Once mid-March happened, a lot of these employees, and some of them are 7 or 8 salary figure employees, they went to their vacation homes, or some of them went to their employees or their second home. Some of them even left the country just to hunker down for a little bit. Our client, that business, they don't know where those employees went to. So those employees might be in other states. The client doesn't know where they are. The business doesn't know where they are. So they don't know whether they should be withholding income taxes on their salaries. They don't know whether that creates nexus for the business itself, income tax nexus for itself. And then also sales tax nexus to the extent that they might be subject to sales taxes. It's finance industry, but in some cases they could be subject to sales taxes. So that's going to come down to one of our lessons learned at the end of this conversation. I think we're going to talk about things to take away here. And one is we need to know where your employees are, especially in this telecommuting environment that we've created because of remote work. On the income tax nexus side, this can impact a lot of things. Some states are still cost of performance sourcing for income tax, and I don't know how many tax people we have on the line, but depending on the state, where you do business and how you source that income from your business, that's really different among the states. and where you have people could change how you source your income. Payroll, not as important, but you could have payroll in other states as well. Withholding issues, unemployment issues come up, unemployment insurance issues come up. Are you registered for unemployment insurance in these states? And then credits and incentives, we'll mention that briefly. State payroll tax withholding, I think this is a very important concept to understand. We're going to talk about the convenience of the employer test here in a minute. Reciprocal agreements. So if you know Pennsylvania, New Jersey, I think we have reciprocal income tax agreements. They're generally very limited to states border to other states. This is a high level list of I think all of our reciprocity states right now. It's not very helpful. And I think in a lot of cases for businesses trying to understand where their employees are, if you have employees that might be living or holding up in other states, it could be all over the place. So you may have these withholding requirements in new states. You can see how these issues just kind of domino effect, and they get worse as the longer you have remote employees and the more that you don't analyze it. Keep in mind now that we're also in October and the calendar year is almost ending. So it's important to be thinking about these things if you haven't already. Also, sales tax mentioned a couple times, sourcing of services, property tax, a couple things here. Personal property tax, Pennsylvania doesn't have a personal property tax. Some states do. If you have employees taking office equipment home to a different state, you might have personal property tax obligations in a different state. You might have to register in that state and then file returns in that state that you never did before. So understanding where your equipment is, where your property is important. Individual income taxes. And then a federal solution. I know I saw Jennifer has some notes on this as well. We've had, and we can talk about it under her slides, we've had some efforts on the congressional side of things to create some federal law here in terms of mobile employees. And this doesn't apply to athletes, doesn't apply to musicians or things like that. Basically, the intent of these provisions is to try to get a law in place where no state can subject you to personal income tax unless you're there for 30 days. They haven't been very successful, and we can talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. There's also some efforts on the state side. Illinois and North Dakota both have some kind of a similar mobile workforce provision that's been good for employees. Residency issues, again, most of the time we're talking to businesses. If you're talking to individuals or if you're thinking about the employees you have in your firm, some of these employees, they're going to start creating for themselves residency issues. And I think Tim mentioned we're at 7 months now. So if you have an employee that might be in a different state than where they were living, so maybe a vacation home, they could create something called statutory residency in that state, meaning you could have 2 states that want to tax that employee's income. So on the employee side too, and if you're one of these people that has been remote or has worked somewhere else, this is something to be thinking about. You could quite easily establish residency in a state that you didn't intend to establish. We had a client who was held up in California, went to his vacation home in California, got very, very close to that 6-month statutory residency threshold. So we needed to get him out of there and get him back home. And then one thing, so I'm running a little over my time, but I just want to say there's a lot of movement now. There's a lot of issues both on the employee side and on the business side. And one thing I want to just briefly mention is that possible new state and local taxes on the horizon. Wealth taxes, as exit taxes, and gross receipts taxes. States have to recoup their budgets from this pandemic shortfalls that we're seeing. New Jersey, they have a millionaire's tax. It was incomes over 5 million. Now it's incomes over 1 million for 2020. We're going to see more states look at these provisions. California proposed on a exit tax So if you move out of California, California still wants to tax you for 10 years. So these are things to think about on the employee side or your personal income side. So I think with that, and I have some slides here on credits and incentives. As a business, I think it's important to remember that if you have current credits or incentives, or if you're looking at engaging in this transformation where you're moving into a new place, there might be state money available for you. And I think states are aware of that too. So I think with that, I'm going to let Jennifer speak here to the convenience of the employer test and some very interesting local issues.
Thank you very much, Mo. I appreciate that. Just so that everybody knows, if you do have to jump off at 9 o'clock, we are recording this and we will have a follow-up video that you'll be able to log on at the TMACC website. And so don't be afraid if you do have that 9 o'clock appointment and jump off. We'll continue this. And we'll also make sure that the slide deck is available to the participants that have joined us today. And with that, Jennifer, tell us a little bit about the convenience rule.
Okay, thank you, Mo and Tim. I'm just going to go ahead and share my slides now. Okay, so as Mo mentioned about the nexus rule, the convenience rule is actually kind of the flip side of that, where an employer has an established location in a state. They have offices where you could work, and the employer has no problem with you working in that office, but that you may choose to work from home for your convenience. So we're going to start talking about the fact that some states do have a rule where if you could work from your employer's location and you live in a different state, but you're only working from home for convenience, that is subject to tax. So Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New York are some states that do use this rule. And generally, again, it applies when employees live in one state and their employer is based in another state. So again, you're taxed on all your universal income at your home state level, and then you can also be taxed at your employer state, unless there's a reciprocity agreement. And in Pennsylvania's case, New Jersey, Ohio, and West Virginia are examples of states that have reciprocity with us. So therefore, the convenience rule wouldn't apply in those cases. But when it does apply, there's withholding and filing required for both states. And again, it doesn't apply with the reciprocity states. But the theory is that if you're teleworking and it's for your convenience, otherwise you could be at your employer's location, and the employer is taking advantage of the local benefits and services of that other state. So why not pay the tax? This shouldn't be a surprise, but it actually is quite aggressively enforced in New York. And there's been a lot of activity out of New York based on this rule. Pennsylvania to date has not had a significant challenge, but we will see what happens in the coming months and weeks now that we're in this new normal. So even though it sounds like it's convenience of the employer, it's actually all about the convenience of the employee. And the test in most states is, was it a necessity for you to work in your home state? If so, then not necessarily subject to tax. When you're taxing in more than one jurisdiction, that means that it is double taxation. And generally, double taxation is the sign of a poor tax system. So there's usually a remedy available for that. And in most states, there is a remedy of a credit. So you would apply to your home state for a credit for taxes paid to the employer state. So now that we're in COVID times, how is the convenience rule playing in that sense? Will it be enforced? How will that work? because arguably, if you have been told to stay at home because of an executive order, for example, in Pennsylvania, the executive order required non-essential businesses to close and you were required to work from home. How does that work? Because it's not for your convenience, it's the law. Also, if your employer has shut down their offices for safety purposes, how is that for your convenience? So we need to take a look at what is the impact of those executive orders. What about the employer restrictions? Will those policies mitigate enforcement of the convenience rule? What about if you are trying to get credits? At least in Vermont, there's a requirement to get a credit that you had to physically work in the other state. So how is telecommuting going to affect the credits? We don't know those answers yet, and we probably won't until after tax time of next year. Well, as I mentioned, you would think that based on all of the circumstances with COVID, employer restrictions, executive orders, that the states might tell you, okay, don't worry about it. We're not going to enforce it due to the emergency. Like we saw with most examples with Nexus, there were some states that gave guidance about that. Well, we look to the Pennsylvania Department of Revenue to see what their position is. And this was the question on their website. If an employee who normally works in PA and receives PA source compensation works from home in another state temporarily due to the COVID-19 pandemic, does the source of his compensation change to non-PA source compensation? So if it's not PA source compensation, then the convenience rule would not apply. This is what the PA Department of Revenue said. Governor Tom Wolf issued a proclamation of disaster emergency on March 6, 2020. If the employee is working from home temporarily due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the department would not consider that a change to the sourcing of the employee's compensation. It would remain PA source income for all tax purposes. So the PA Department of Revenue position is that they will still treat the income as Pennsylvania source income. So if you live in Delaware and your employer is based in Pennsylvania, and due to the executive order signed by Governor Wolf and perhaps restrictions issued by your own company, you were not permitted to come to Pennsylvania to work from your office, it's still going to be treated as Pennsylvania source income for purposes of the convenience rule. Another question on the employer side was, will a PA employer of a non-resident employee temporarily working from home due to the COVID-19 pandemic in a state that doesn't have a reciprocity agreement with PA be required to withhold personal income tax on compensation? And the answer two was, if the employee is working from home temporarily due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the department would not consider that as a change. And that means the employee's compensation remains PA sourced and the employer is still required to withhold on the compensation. So based on those responses from Pennsylvania, we know that the convenience rule is alive and well, even though the COVID-19 pandemic, resulting executive orders and company shutdowns would arguably not be due to the employee's convenience, but more necessity. So what about Delaware? The Delaware Division of Revenue, did they take a position on this? No, they haven't issued any guidance as of today's date. So they have not said whether or not they will enforce the convenience rule, although I don't have a crystal ball and I can't predict. I'm willing to bet that they will follow Pennsylvania's example and still enforce the convenience rule. So what about the city of Philadelphia? As Mo alluded to, or it might have been Tim, Philadelphia does have the wage tax for any employees that work in Philadelphia. They also follow the convenience of the employer rule in Philadelphia. So just to recap for those who may not be familiar, the city of Philadelphia has a wage tax for residents of Philadelphia on whatever income source, and for non-residents on income they've earned while working for employers in the city. If a non-resident employee works from home for their convenience, Philadelphia will still apply the wage tax. But they have a requirement of the employment standard. So if you're required to work outside of Philadelphia, for example, if the office location is not set up for full-time employees, but is just kind of a satellite office, then there's no wage tax due. Philadelphia, for some good news here, did say that non-resident employees who are ordered to work from home, so arguably that would include executive orders and or employer orders, are not going to be subject to wage tax. They even said that if there is wage tax withheld by your employer by mistake, there is a remedy to correct that. But if you are working from a different location, so for example, if you're working in my township, Count Township, you would be required to have withholding and payment of tax for your local income tax. So you need to make sure that you're paying attention to the number of days that you're working in which location. And we'll talk a little bit more about that further into the program. And of course, wage tax is still going to be withheld for residents of Philadelphia, regardless of where they are working. So we're going to get into a little bit more of a discussion in a moment about how we solve the problem of the convenience rule. There are some different approaches that have been taken, and we're going to talk about legislation that's been attempted and also some litigation that's been attempted. Again, in Pennsylvania, we haven't had a challenge to the convenience rule, but there was a challenge in New York. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about that, and then we'll turn it over to Mo and Tim to kind of have our panel discussion. So in New York, there was a challenge. Huckabee, Mr. Huckabee was a resident of Tennessee who was working for a New York employer. He was working about 75% of his time in Tennessee and the other 25% in New York. When he filed his taxes, he apportioned them, so he only paid 75% tax to Tennessee and 25% to New York. The New York Department of Revenue took issue with that because they wanted to tax 100% of his income. He did challenge it and he lost, unfortunately for him. He then appealed it to the Supreme Court, which declined to hear the case. So we don't know what the Supreme Court's position would be on the convenience rule, but we may find out in the coming months to a year, because Massachusetts has implemented a convenience rule, and that is actually now being challenged by New Hampshire. So we will not be discussing that case today because it's all very preliminary, but that's something to keep in mind, that there may be a Supreme Court position on the convenience rule in the near future if they decide to take the case. All right, so I am going to pause my screen sharing here, and then we can turn it back over to Tim.
Thank you, Jennifer. And then thank you, Mo, too, for the insight that you both provided on the convenience rule and then Nexus. I think these are the two important topics for us to actually address. I know that the governor's disaster declaration was extended in September, early September, and it will run till late November again for that. So we're still under that declaration. We'll see, and more than likely he will renew that. But as we have the conversation, in the state legislature about wanting to open up the state, this is one of those sidebar conversations that could impact, businesses. We want to be open, But then we also have to be aware of those businesses that are actually not planning to come back until January, for their staff. So it's an interesting challenge that we have. So Mo, what are some of the things that you're seeing at the national level for some resolution to this? And I know that where we are in the election cycle, that and this issue has been hanging out there for so long. It really has popped up because of so many people working from home. Maybe sometime next year we'll address this at a national level. But what are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. This is complex, and it's not convenient for businesses, especially multi-state businesses with employees all over the place. On the national level, we have this mobile workforce legislation, which would make it much easier. I don't know if it's good for the accounting and tax business, but it would provide some uniformity. And something Congress doesn't really do very much is address state and local taxes. Having a uniform provision where you do maybe have a 30-day threshold. One of the proposals more recently from the HEALS Act, which was a collection of Senate bills that came out recently for COVID relief. I think they had a 90-day provision in there for 2020 that basically said if you're in a state for 90 days because you're working there because of the pandemic, so doctors and first responders and things like that, you wouldn't owe any state tax in that jurisdiction unless you were there for over 90 days. And then 30 days for everyone else. While those would provide uniformity, and there is bipartisan support. So to be clear, a mobile workforce type bill has passed the House 3 times in the last probably 10 years. There are a few roadblocks, and New York State is one of those. So the way the legislation has to move through both the House and the Senate, the New York State Congress people aren't big fans of that because they really want every tax dollar that of everybody working in their state. That doesn't mean we won't see some progress on this just because there is bipartisan support. We're not going to see it this year. It's not going to be in any COVID relief package if there is one. There's progress on this every year, Tim. It just never seems to get anywhere. At this point, we now have our state tax advocacy groups are taking the position where they're going to attack this from the state level. So we have Illinois, for example, and they're going to create some model legislation. And I think the thinking is that if we can get 20 states or 25 states to adopt a provision like this, where they have a 30-day threshold, maybe that will mean every state will eventually adopt one and provide some uniformity for workers that have to travel to other states. In terms of, yeah.
Oh,
go ahead.
What else, Mo?
No, well, in terms of, we talked about the guidance for some states other than the convenience states, where maybe if you're in the state, a state's going to say that you don't have nexus in our state. We're going to be nice. We're going to be benevolent and say, because of the pandemic, you're not going to have nexus in the state. Those are really temporary. Almost all of them are listed, has language, something like for the duration of the pandemic. So as soon that I think means, until the executive order ends, and that might happen. Some of this guidance, it's all really guidance. It's not law, it's just guidance. And we could see some of that guidance revoked as well. There's been about 14 or 15 states that have provided something in the last maybe 2 months. We've only had 1 or 2 additional states provide guidance on that issue. So I think it's going to be complicated, and it goes into our things that are takeaways. Is really, you got to know where your employees are. You got to know where they're going.
Jennifer?
So as I was talking about the Huckabee case from New York, that kind of was the impetus for several attempts at legislation even before COVID was our reality. That was back in 2005. And when the Supreme Court declined to hear the case, there was so much concern about the impact that it might have on teleworking and work in New York in general. So that kind of led to multiple attempts, and there have been multiple attempts over the years to have something that's been a more permanent legislation. Then also we've had attempts from actually in New York State, there was a state legislator who wanted to try to have a temporary COVID bill that would be effective from the March date of the Governor Cuomo's executive order through to September, which was when their executive order was finished. And that is still kind of lagging in the New York state legislators are not moving on that. It's kind of in their finance committee. So I'm not sure that we're going to see a lot of movement, at least from those convenience rule states, because they're very focused on trying to collect those taxes. So we shall see.
So Mo, yesterday morning, I received an email from the public policy group from ACT, which I sit on, and what they had heard through our lobbying firm that's there is that there could be some legislation if another bill would be passed for relief. This bill that was sent over to me would be the proposed concessions to the Senate include a remote work or fix, which includes the Grassley COVID-19 bill modeled on the bipartisan legislation S 3995. That probably means much more to you than many other of us on the phone here. Introduced by Senator Majority Whip John Toome from Republican from South Dakota, and Sherrod Brown from a Democrat from Ohio.
Yeah.
So is that something that's going to move? It says here that the provision would treat wages earned from remote work performed by employees as taxable only in the employer's primary location during the pandemic. That way, the businesses with the workers who are left their urban locations once their office is shut down won't face tax in the state or local jurisdiction those employees are working with from temporary. Is that a?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of them. There have been about 4 or 5 proposals, actual proposals submitted from either the House or the Senate. So when we look at this, we think, a couple considerations. We have the New York congressman. These are bipartisans. Sherrod Brown is a Democrat and Toome's a Republican. So these are bipartisans in both chambers of Congress. And I think that's very encouraging. A lot of times these issues, though, mobile workforce, there's no money in it. There's no allocation in it from a congressperson perspective. So they don't, not a lot of people want to spend time on this because there's no benefit for them. I know that sounds cynical, but that's really the case, right? We're not talking about any federal revenues. We're not talking about any really
You're talking about
monies
relief.
on the federal level. Yeah. You're talking about really state taxpayer relief on the state level. So it's hard to campaign on that. Right now, there is the election. I think putting a provision like this into a bigger package is likely one of the best vehicles to get something passed. But any legislation like this, and Jennifer actually has a slide on it, Congress can enact this type of bill where they basically tell the states that they can't subject people to income tax if they're working there temporarily from another state. Congress can do that. They have the authority to do that. All those bills have to go through the House Judiciary Committee, and the House Judiciary Committee is run by Jerry Nadler, who's from New York. So it's broad bipartisan support, not a lot of there are a couple I mentioned New York several times. It's not just New York. There are a couple of states that really don't want to see this type of legislation because they don't want that 30-day threshold, because a lot of people, for example, go into New York to work for 0 to 30 days. But I personally put this at 0% passing in 2020. And it's hard to predict. I don't, this Congress, who knows what they're going to do, but my best guess is that this is not going to pass in 2020.
Yeah,
So-
actually, I have some data from the Scopus Labs. They estimated the House bill at 2% likelihood of enactment and the Senate bill at 4% likelihood. So that's
There you have it.
that's it.
So before we move into the close here about talking about April 15th of 2021, I do have a couple of questions that have popped up on the screen here that I can ask them. Now would be the time. One of them was, would this create any challenges with part-time staff member who is also a student who lives in a different state but working for you while attending school?
I mean,
So we do?
yeah. Do you pay them? Are they an employee? They probably are, right? I don't think you can have unpaid internships now.
Right.
Or they said part-time, right? So, you know, if they are an employee, then that could impact you. Yeah. Their presence in a different state. Maybe you don't have any activity in that state. You've never had any activity in that state. Well, now you have an employee there, even if they're only working a couple hours, and even if they're you know, a student, they're maybe not full-time.
Right. It depends on where that student is declaring its residency.
Well, that's an employee of the business, so they're
Okay.
representing the business. That's essentially the business having presence in that other jurisdiction. So there could be issues for the student depending on where his residency is and where he is located for school on the individual side. But for the business side, you know, absolutely.
And there's no distinction between part-time and full-time when it comes to the convenience rule application.
Yeah, great point.
Great. And then the other question, any insight on PA's earned income tax, especially if an employee works in a municipality that doesn't have an EIT, but lives now in is WFH, and Beth, you may have to help me with it, due to COVID.
Work from home.
Sorry. Due to COVID in another municipality that doesn't have an EIT, has any guidance been offered from the Pennsylvania DCD?
I don't know anything about the Pennsylvania EIT, EITC. I don't know if Jennifer's familiar with that.
We haven't received any guidance as to that that I'm aware of. I would imagine that if your municipality does not collect EIT, and so you're not typically withholding, but you might be working from a different municipality, that could be an issue that needs attention from your employer. Might need to look into withholding for that particular municipality. We're talking about preparing for April 15th. One of the things that we recommend is making sure you're keeping track of the number of days working in each specific municipality, and then also keeping your HR or accounting department at your company in the loop on those numbers as well for withholding purposes.
Yeah, that's a great point. We've worked with a ton of businesses, both on the medium size, big size, that they don't have a system or the capability to track where their employees work. So unless you're you know, working for a law firm and billing in 6-minute increments, right, Jennifer? You may not, your business likely doesn't have something very sophisticated to track that somebody's working in this location for this day. And sometimes it's something as simple as an Excel database that you need to understand where the employees are. And if you have a lot of employees, there are some more sophisticated solutions available, apps and things like that.
So as we head into the close, in the back of my mind is that we don't want any surprises for April 15th of 2021. Jennifer, could you start us out with what we kind of need to know?
Sure, I'm going to share my slideshow again so I can get us to this. Oops. I apologize. This is I'm just going to quickly work through these because it did not start where I wanted it to. You can see all the attempts at legislation in the meantime. And these slides we can make available to anybody that's interested. We just are quickly moving through some of these for our purposes here today. All right, so for employers, again, it's important to be communicating with your employees so that they're aware that this is a potential issue. If they've not been telecommuting prior to this year, or if this has not been something that's come up before, it's important to get ahead of it and communicate so that they are aware. Also, you should be paying attention to which states have reciprocity and which are convenience rule states. If you're an employer based in Pennsylvania or Delaware, you should be aware of that already, but this is something to pay attention to. Make sure you're withholding properly and keeping records to the best of your ability. And confirm with the employee where they are living and working during the tax year. You also want to make sure you're confirming the taxing entity or entities to make sure that you're following any kind of withholding procedures that are required. And keep accurate records again to the best of your ability to make sure that you are keeping records. Make sure you're prepared to produce documentation. If your employee has an agreement with you whereby you are requiring them to work from home for any length of time, this would be important to have available. Also, any executive orders or so forth, and also your employer policies during the pandemic. So I'll turn it over to Mo to talk about the employee side.
Yeah, Jennifer, you make really great points in your slides here, and I think the one thing I want to highlight is that it's both on your side as an employee and on the business side. So if you're working somewhere else and your employer isn't withholding for you in that jurisdiction, and they may not be, that doesn't mean you don't have the responsibility to withhold. So keeping your own records is very important. As a business owner or as someone responsible for the tax function or overseeing that or understanding that, knowing where your employees are, that's on the business side, because that's going to create the nexus issues, which could come with income tax surprises for corporate income tax surprises, sales tax nexus. So I think understanding both those components, both in your side and your business side.
And on the flip side for employees, we basically would recommend the same thing. Make sure you're keeping your own records, your own employment agreement documentation. Don't just rely on the employer to provide that. If you don't have copies of those documents, start now by tracking those down. And also, I find it helpful, even if you have guidance like the Pennsylvania Department of Revenue, it might be worth just keeping those executive orders and so forth to make sure that you can appeal if necessary or if possible.
And that's a really good point, because Jennifer showed some questions and answers, FAQs from the department's website. I've worked in Pennsylvania a number of years. Sometimes those disappear, and you're like, well, that was really that was they had a question there that addressed my problem directly, and one day they just took it away. So we don't know what the states are going to do in terms of this guidance and how aggressive they may be, or if they just change their position later on. So documentation is key.
And keeping your records, again, as to where you worked, number of days, and whether it was telecommuting or otherwise. So definitely make sure you're keeping those records.
Well, thank you again, Jennifer and Mo. It was great to have you on. Your insight has been tremendous. It's not a simple issue. It's a tax issue. There are a lot of variables that go into play, and in these uncertainty times, we just have to be able to as you said, document everything that we do so that we can support it later on. If you are interested in reaching Jennifer or Mo, or have a question about telework or taxation, I'd love to hear from you. You can reach me at tphelps@tmac.org. To learn more about TMACC and the transportation demand management that we're providing here in Chester County, check us out online at tmac.org. So everyone, thank you for joining us today, and have a great day.